Ma'am, this is a federal courtroom, not a law school debate club. Judge William Morrison's voice cut through the packed Chicago courtroom. Every eye turned to the woman at the defense table. Mid-50s, simple black suit, reading glasses on a chain. She looked like somebody's aunt who had wandered into the wrong building. She didn't flinch, just quietly reached into her worn briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. What Morrison couldn't see was the letterhead, Office of the Chief Justice, United States Supreme Court. What he didn't know was that this small-town lawyer had walked away from the most powerful position in American law 18 months ago. Her name was Judge Sarah Elizabeth Collins, former Chief Judge of the Federal Appeals Court, and Morrison was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Welcome to Stil Human, where every person carries a story that can change everything. If you believe in the power of human character over titles and appearances, hit subscribe. These stories need witnesses. Before we continue Sarah's story, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And have you ever seen someone's true strength surprise everyone around them? Now let's see what Judge Morrison is about to learn. The Dirksen Federal Building in Chicago had seen its share of drama over the decades. Mob trials, political corruption cases, corporate scandals that made headlines across the nation. But what was unfolding in courtroom 2247 on this cold Tuesday morning would become legendary for entirely different reasons. Judge William Morrison adjusted his robes and surveyed his domain with satisfaction. 15 years on the federal bench had taught him one thing above all others. Respect was earned through authority, and authority was displayed through power. At 58, he had built a reputation as a no-nonsense jurist who didn't tolerate unprepared attorneys or frivolous arguments. The case before him today was routine by his standards. United States v. Martinez. A young father facing deportation despite having lived in America since he was 3 years old. The prosecution was represented by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a sharp woman in her 30s with an impressive conviction rate. The defense, well, that was where things got interesting. Sarah Collins had driven 3 hours from the small town of Millbrook, Illinois, to take this case pro bono. At 52, she had the appearance of someone who had deliberately chosen invisibility. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her black suit came from a department store, not a designer boutique. She carried a briefcase that had seen better days and wore comfortable flats instead of power heels. Nobody in that courtroom knew that 6 years earlier, nobody knew that senators had sought her advice, that Supreme Court justices had consulted her on constitutional matters, that foreign governments had requested her guidance on judicial reform. Nobody knew because Sarah had made sure of it. Your Honor, Sarah began, standing to address the court. I move to dismiss all charges against Mr. Martinez on the grounds that... Morrison held up his hand dismissively. Counselor, before you waste the court's time with whatever legal theory you've cobbled together, let me ask you a simple question. How many federal immigration cases have you argued? Sarah paused, considering her answer carefully. In truth, she had overseen more than 200 immigration appeals during her tenure on the circuit court. She had authored the landmark decision in Chen v. United States that established new protections for childhood arrivals. She had been consulted on 3 different pieces of immigration legislation. I have experience with immigration law, Your Honor, Morrison smirked. Experience, that's lawyers speak for, this is my first case, isn't it? A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. Sarah noticed Morrison's court clerk, a young woman named Amy, shift uncomfortably in her seat. Something in Amy's expression suggested recognition, but Sarah couldn't be sure. "Your Honor, if I may proceed with my motion, you may not." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Ms. What was your name again? Collins? Sarah Collins?" Morrison made a show of looking through his papers. "Collins? Collins? I don't see you on the approved list of federal practitioners for this district. Are you even licensed to practice in Illinois?" Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "I am licensed in Illinois, Your Honor. I submitted my pro hac vici motion yesterday, and it was approved by the clerk's office." "Approved by whom, Amy?" The court clerk spoke up nervously. "Sir, I processed the motion myself. Everything was in order." Morrison shot Amy a sharp look that made her shrink back. "Ms. Rodriguez, in the future I expect to personally review any out-of-district applications before they're approved. We can't have every small-town attorney wandering in here thinking they can practice federal law." Sarah felt something shift inside her. For 18 months, she had endured condescension from shop clerks who treated her like a suburban housewife. She had smiled politely when waitresses called her hun, and bank tellers spoke to her slowly as if she couldn't understand basic concepts. She had chosen this humility, embraced it even, as part of her healing process. But watching Morrison humiliate Amy Rodriguez, a hard-working young woman doing her job correctly, touched something deeper than personal pride. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new edge that made several attorneys in the gallery look up from their phones. "Perhaps we could focus on the constitutional issues at hand rather than procedural theatrics." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "Mr. Martinez was brought to this country as a 3-year-old child. He has lived here for 23 years, graduated from Northwestern University, pays taxes, and has 2 American-born children. The government's position that he lacks good moral character because he was unable to fix his immigration status as a toddler is constitutionally absurd. Counselor, I'll determine what's constitutionally absurd in my courtroom." Sarah opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Your Honor, I have 17 circuit court decisions that directly contradict the government's interpretation of the statute. Would you like me to cite them?" Morrison waved his hand dismissively. "Ms. Collins, I've been practicing law since before you were born. I don't need a lecture on constitutional interpretation from someone who probably learned about federal procedure last week." That was when Sarah made her decision. She had retired from the federal bench, not because of age or politics or burnout. She had stepped down because her daughter Emma, her only child, had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at age 27. A genetic anomaly, the doctors said. 1 in 10 million chance. Sarah had walked away from the most prestigious position in American law to spend Emma's final coherent months with her. Emma had died 6 months ago, just after her 29th birthday. The last thing she had said to her mother was, "Mom, promise me you'll go back to fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." Sarah had kept that promise, in small ways, taking cases like Martinez's, helping families navigate bureaucratic nightmares, using her legal skills quietly in a small Illinois town. But she had never used her full power, her real influence, her true identity, until now. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that made the entire courtroom fall silent, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Sarah reached into her briefcase again, this time pulling out a different folder. She walked slowly to the bench, her posture changing subtly with each step. The hesitant deference was gone, replaced by something that made Morrison lean forward unconsciously. "Your Honor, before we continue, I think you should see this." She handed him a document. Morrison looked down at it with annoyance that quickly transformed into confusion, then recognition, then something approaching panic. It was a letter from Chief Justice John Roberts, dated just 3 weeks earlier. "Dear Judge Collins, the court continues to miss your wisdom and insight. Your opinion in Hernandez v. ICE remains the gold standard for immigration jurisprudence. I know you've chosen a different path for personal reasons, but please know that your contribution to American justice will never be forgotten. The door to public service remains open whenever you're ready to walk through it. With deep respect and admiration, John G. Roberts, Jr., Chief Justice. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he read. When he looked up, Sarah was no longer the small-town lawyer who had walked into his courtroom. She stood with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 15 years commanding respect at the highest levels of American government. Judge Collins, Morrison whispered, and the title hanging in the air changed everything. Amy Rodriguez, the court clerk, audibly gasped. She had recognized Sarah from the beginning, but had convinced herself it couldn't really be the Judge Collins. Now, seeing Morrison's reaction, she knew her instincts had been correct. The gallery began to murmur as words spread row by row. Attorneys pulled out their phones, Googling frantically. Reporters in the back row started typing furiously. Sarah Collins, former Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, the youngest woman ever appointed to the federal appellate bench, author of more than 400 opinions that had shaped modern American law, the judge who had been mentioned as a potential Supreme Court nominee before she had mysteriously stepped down 18 months earlier. And Morrison had just spent the last hour treating her like an incompetent first-year law student. "Judge Collins," Morrison said, his voice now carrying a tremor of respect and fear. I had no idea. Your reputation precedes you, of course. It's an honor to have you in my courtroom." Sarah nodded slightly, acknowledging the change in tone without accepting the late-arriving courtesy. "Thank you, Judge Morrison. Now if we may return to Mr. Martinez's case." Of course. Please, proceed with your motion." Sarah walked back to the defense table, but now every eye in the courtroom followed her movement. Her client, Miguel Martinez, looked confused, but hopeful. He didn't understand the shift in dynamics, but he could feel the power change in the room. "Your Honor, as I was saying before we were interrupted, Mr. Martinez's case represents a fundamental misapplication of immigration law. The government's position relies on a misreading of statutory language that has been repeatedly rejected by circuit courts across the country." Sarah opened her folder and began citing cases with the fluidity of someone who had not just read these decisions, but had written many of them. Her voice carried the quiet authority of absolute expertise, and Morrison found himself taking notes like a law student. In Chen v. United States, a decision I authored in 2019, the Second Circuit held that individuals brought to this country as minor children cannot be held responsible for immigration violations that occurred without their knowledge or consent. The Supreme Court declined to review that decision, making it settled law. Morrison nodded frantically. Yes, of course, the Chen decision. "Furthermore, Your Honor, Mr. Martinez's situation is precisely what Congress intended to address with the Dreamers Protection Act. While that legislation remains stalled in Congress, its principles reflect established constitutional protections that this court is bound to uphold." Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh, who had been confidently prepared for an easy victory, now found herself completely outmatched. She had read about Judge Collins in law school, had studied her opinions, had never imagined she would face her across a courtroom. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, "the government has failed to demonstrate that Mr. Martinez poses any threat to public safety or national security. They have failed to show that his removal serves any compelling state interest. What they have shown is a willingness to destroy an American family to satisfy a bureaucratic interpretation of law that runs counter to both constitutional principles and basic human decency." Morrison, who an hour earlier had been ready to summarily deny any defense motion, now found himself nodding in agreement. "Judge Collins, your analysis is thorough. Ms. Walsh, does the government wish to respond?" Walsh stood shakily. "Your Honor, While we respect Judge Collins's distinguished career, the law is clear that— "The law," Sarah interrupted gently, "is what we make it when we choose justice over convenience, compassion over bureaucracy, and constitutional principles over political expedience." She turned slightly toward the gallery, where reporters were capturing every word. "Mr. Martinez came to this country as a 3-year-old boy. He has lived here longer than he lived anywhere else. His children are American citizens. His wife is an American citizen. He pays taxes, follows the law, and contributes to his community. If we cannot find room in America for people like Miguel Martinez, then we have lost sight of who we are as a nation." The courtroom was completely silent. Morrison shifted in his seat, aware that his handling of this case would be scrutinized not just by his colleagues, but by legal scholars and journalists across the country. "Your Honor," Sarah concluded, "I move for immediate dismissal of all charges and a permanent injunction against any future removal proceedings against Mr. Martinez." Morrison looked at the government attorney, Ms. Walsh. Walsh closed her folder with resignation. "Your Honor, in light of the circumstances, the government withdraws its opposition to the defense motion." "Very well," Morrison said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized the morning. "The court grants the defense motion. All charges against Mr. Martinez are dismissed. The government is permanently enjoined from pursuing removal proceedings." Miguel Martinez burst into tears, embracing his wife and children who had been sitting in the front row. "Sarah." As the courtroom began to empty, Morrison called out, "Judge Collins, might I have a word?" Sarah approached the bench. Morrison had stepped down from his elevated position, meeting her at eye level. "Judge Collins, I owe you an apology. My behavior today was unprofessional and inexcusable." Sarah studied him for a long moment. "Judge Morrison, may I share something with you?" "Of course." 18 months ago, I was exactly where you are now. I sat on a bench, looking down at attorneys, making assumptions about their capabilities based on their appearance or their backgrounds. I thought my position gave me the right to dismiss people without truly seeing them. Morrison listened intently. Then life taught me a lesson about humility, about loss, about what really matters. Today, you learned that lesson too, but you learned it in public, in front of colleagues and reporters. That's painful, I'm sure. Morrison nodded, embarrassment coloring his cheeks. But here's what I want you to remember. Every attorney who comes into your courtroom, every defendant who stands before your bench, every clerk who serves in your chambers, they all have stories you don't know, experiences you can't imagine, and dignity that deserves your respect, regardless of their title or position. Sarah glanced back at Amy Rodriguez, who was watching the conversation with fascination. That young woman you dismissed earlier, Amy Rodriguez, graduated top of her class from Northwestern Law. She could be working at any white shoe firm in Chicago, making 3 times what she earns here. Instead, she chose public service because she believes in justice. When you humiliated her in front of this courtroom, you didn't just disrespect an employee. You disrespected someone who has dedicated her life to the same ideals we all swore to uphold. Morrison followed Sarah's gaze to Amy, then walked over to his clerk. Ms. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology as well. Your work today was exemplary, and my comments were inappropriate. Amy smiled, her confidence restored. Thank you, Your Honor. As Sarah left the federal building, reporters waited outside. She paused at the top of the steps, looking out at the city where she had once wielded enormous power and where she had just chosen to use that power one more time. Judge Collins, called a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. Will you be returning to active practice? Are you considering a comeback? Sarah smiled slightly. I never left the practice of law. I just changed how I practice it. What brought you out of retirement for this case? Sarah thought of Emma, of her daughter's final words, of the promise she had made and kept today. Sometimes we're called to stand up not because we want to, but because someone needs us to. Mr. Martinez needed someone to fight for him. That's what lawyers... 6 months later, Judge Morrison would be known throughout the federal district for his respectful treatment of all attorneys, regardless of their experience or background. Amy Rodriguez would be promoted to deputy chief clerk and would eventually attend law school herself, inspired by the day she witnessed true power exercised with grace. Miguel Martinez would become a U.S. citizen 2 years later, and his children would grow up in the only country they had ever known as home. And Sarah Collins would return to Millbrook, Illinois, where she would continue taking cases for people who needed someone to fight for them. She would never seek publicity or recognition. She would simply do the work, case by case, person by person, carrying forward the promise she had made to a daughter who understood that true strength isn't about the title you hold. It's about what you do when someone needs you to be strong. Judge Sarah Collins walked away from the pinnacle of American law not because she had failed, but because she learned what success really means. It means being there when someone needs you. It means using your gifts for others. It means remembering that beneath every appearance is a human being with dignity. Today, in a Chicago courtroom, we witnessed what happens when someone who could have stayed silent chose to speak. When someone who could have remained hidden chose to stand in the light. Judge Morrison learned about humility. Miguel Martinez learned that justice has a human face. Amy Rodriguez learned that respect is something you give, not take. And we learn that the most important question isn't who has the most power, but who will use their power to help others. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's true character changed everything? Share that story below.
Subscribe for more stories that remind us who we can be when we choose to see the humanity in each other. The next time you see someone being dismissed, ask yourself, what would Judge Sarah Collins do? Sometimes the answer might change everything.